Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force and the 10th mission of the US Marine campaign. Coalition forces are now ploughing on towards Damascus, with our 26th MEU and some attached US Army elements punching south down Highway 1, while the Syrian army tries to stall for the time it needs to either dig in for a bit of Gotterdammerung or flee across the border with Lebanon. This means that speed is of the essence. The less time the Syrians have to prepare for the endgame, the easier it'll be to smash them. Ahead of our Marines is a reconnaissance screen from the Army's 1st HBCT 1st Division, and this morning one of their platoons reached the Gorge. The gorge is an obvious choke point, dominated by the Jabal Sukfir mountain, which makes that peak a chunk of key terrain. But when the Cav Scouts attempted to climb it from the north, they lost their lead vehicle to a mine. Abandoning that route, they resumed their advance down the highway itself and entered the gorge, only to run into a prepared ambush. Trapped in the gorge with 3 vehicles already knocked out and casualties, mines and Syrian ATGMs to deal with, the scouts need support, and fast. Lucky for them, the MEU's reinforced Gulf Company isn't far behind. A Gulf Company is deploying where the highway enters the map to the north. From here, it runs off towards the right, with the rocky cliffs of the Jabal Sukfir on its left and a stretch of open ground that runs gently up to a valley containing the village of Malula to the right. After about a kilometre, the highway arcs out almost all the way to the right map edge, following the skirts of the mountain and passing an intersection bombed out earlier in the war that is dominated by an old caravanserai, Khan al-Arus. Past that, the highway links up with a secondary road coming from the Dumar army camp, which is just off the far right corner of the map, and takes a left to progress through the Gorge. The first section of this is lined with orchards, but it becomes dramatically narrower and steeper before opening out again and turning off the far right map edge next to a small village. The Jabal Sukfir towers over this entire circuitous route, and controlling it will be essential, but access from Gulf Company's starting location is strictly limited by cliffs to the track where the Cav Scouts ran into mines earlier in the day. It is possible to get up onto the shoulder of the mountain past the intersection in the caravanserai and then to the summit, but this is a much more exposed route than the mined track. In particular, the village of Malula sits in a kind of macro keyhole position, looking down its valley out over the central portion of the map and that route up the mountain. This is something of a concern because the briefing suggests the enemy are staging a battalion-sized ambush. Although their main focus is presumably the Gorge, that kind of force template should give them enough mass to spread around, and the Malula keyhole looks to me like a fantastic position to ambush any blue forces rushing to the rescue of the Cav Scouts. The briefing indicates that the enemy force is primarily infantry based, though presumably heavy on ATGMs, fortifications and mines, but that armoured and or mechanised support could arrive from the Syrian 8th Armoured Division to the east and the Republican Guard Armoured Division to the west. This is the first time that the Republican Guard have been name-dropped by the briefings. Republican Guard armoured units represent a serious threat, and with them being reportedly off to the west, I can't help but eyeball the western, i.e. right, map edge and the hull-down positions it offers with a little concern. On the other hand, this is a mission where a US Army force has gotten into trouble, and the coalition is not messing around allocating forces to bail them out. Starting off on map, we have the lead elements of the reinforced Gulf Company, the Company HQ and 2 platoons riding in AAVs, plus the MEU's ever-reliable 3rd Tank Platoon. Following them up in 5 minutes, we have Gulf Company's final Rifle Platoon and a section from the Combined Anti-Armour Platoon. At the 10-minute mark, the company's supporting elements from the Army's 114 SBCT will arrive, namely a Striker Infantry Platoon, a Striker MGS Platoon, and a Striker AT Platoon. Then, after 15 minutes, we have another tank platoon, this time Army Abrams, and a platoon of Marine Combat Engineers. If that sounds like overkill, we're not quite done yet. From the word go, we have a section of 81mm mortars, a section of 155s, and a pair of Kiowa OH-58D recon helicopters on call. They're going to be joined by a pair of A-10s in 20 minutes, and a pair of AH-64D Apaches in 25. Finally, a recon team has been inserted by Osprey onto the eastern slopes of the Jabal Suqfiyah and will tab onto the map from the left beyond the mined approach to the mountain after about 5 minutes. I suspect this unit is going to be a key enabler, providing I can rapidly get them into position on the summit. In terms of specific objectives, we have a fairly long and complex list. Most importantly, however, are the 1,000 victory points available for destroying the enemy, followed by occupying the mountaintop for 400, and a series of objectives in and around the gorge for a total of 750. There are 80 minutes on the clock, which is not a massive amount of time to cover all the ground I need to, especially seen as though the highway is going to be the fastest avenue of approach for any meaningful strength. Using that route is probably going to result in difficulty and delay though, as it's the most obvious option, and there are plenty of opportunities for enemy forces to present challenges all the way along it. Going up the mountain is probably a non-starter with any kind of usefully sized force, not only because of the mine threat, but because the slopes are so exposed to so much of the map. Going off to the right, in order to get eyes down the highway and potentially clear out the Malula keyhole, could unlock the central route, but it also involves a concerning amount of exposed ground, and the infantry I would need to deal with the village would have to travel in their vulnerable AAVs or strikers in order to get into position quickly enough to be useful. Malula is about 1100 meters away, so walking is going to take a while. Of course, realistically, I have a very chunky, very capable force here, and the best plan is probably to pursue all three of these options at the same time. To focus on an aggressive but not reckless punch down the highway with enabling elements on the flanks, spotting and fire direction on the left from the mountainside, and a supporting attack to clear Malula on the right. The first thing to deal with as the battle starts though is the pickle that the Cav Scouts have gotten themselves into. I've been unable to redeploy them in the setup phase, which makes sense, but I was able to pop smoke and kick the dismounts out. This might seem a little questionable. I haven't issued any movement orders, and good counter-ambush drills generally involve getting off the X as fast as possible because you're where the enemy wants you to be. But at the same time, the only place to go in the confines of the gorge is down into the very bottom, and there are 2 Brads down there already. That area might be dead ground, but rushing the road Bradleys straight in means negotiating a low wall that will slow them down and risking the mine threat advertised by the briefing. So just moving could be as dangerous as staying put. Thinking about the dismounts, the vehicles are naturally vulnerable when they're hemmed in like this, but with the surrounding high ground, the Syrians could have good shots down onto the top armour where they can bypass the Bradley's ERA package. This is an anti-tank ambush after all. There are already 2 Bradleys out of action, and while there will almost certainly be small arms fires zipping about, I think the infantry will be safer braving that and using the Brads and terrain as cover than they will be crammed into the rear compartments of the vehicles. There's a lot that could go wrong whatever decisions I make here, but as well as trying to mitigate my own losses, the enemy has made the fatal mistake of not wiping out all the Bradleys in its initial attack. At kickoff, they immediately pop their smoke as the gorge turns into a 2-way range. On the right, a Syrian squad dug into the ridgeline luckily misses with an RPG. To the front, the enemy opens fire from a series of concrete bunkers and foxholes. Mortars add to the chaos, and the trailing Bradley 100 meters back on the road is knocked out by an ATGM from the right, but the smoke quickly blooms and the advantage shifts. The Syrians can't see through the smoke. The Bradleys, using their thermal imagers, can. They knock out the closest bunker with 25mm cannon fire and blast the enemy dug in next to the farm and up on the south ridge. So the initial contact of the battle probably goes to the US Army on balance, but it's clear that staying on the road isn't a good idea. There's too much Syrian fire here to win a slugging match, so despite the fact the bottom of the gorge is getting mortared, that's the place to go. All the Syrian assets up the valley next to the village will be masked by the farm objective, and the enemy overlooking the dead ground has already gotten a good pasting. So I start running everything off the road. The smoke is already dissipating, and the remaining Bradley up there is narrowly missed by an AT-4 as it crumbles a section of wall under its tracks. The dismounts take a casualty to Dushka fire from a bunker, and the mortars cause some chaos, but by turn 3, the Cav Scouts are, if not totally out of trouble, safe enough. Meanwhile, on the other side of the mountain, the Marines are dealing with a different set of problems. Running the Marine Abrams platoon up to peak the crest of the deployment zone immediately nails down two facts about the enemy. The leftmost Abrams is quickly hit on the turret cheek by an ATGM. This is an AT-14, fired from point 1140, a mound just right of the highway intersection. So the enemy has brought their best ATGM to the fight and is dug in to cover the open ground I will need to cross. Second, 3 BMP-2s appear, transiting from Malula towards the mounds. Flank onto the Abrams, these are easy prey and the tanks rapidly knock them all out, but they are still a significant indicator. The only Syrian force that uses BMP-2s rather than the BMP-1s, 3s and BTRs encountered so far in the campaign are the Republican Guard. So again, the Syrians are bringing their A-game. To these two facts, we can add the presence of enemy forces in the Malula keyhole. My forces haven't made any visual confirmation yet, but one of the OH-58D Kiowas I've sent to screen the right is definitely engaging something in there. In other words, putting all this together, my read of the map seems largely correct. The wide open triangle between Khan al-Rus, Malula and the track up to Jabal Sukfir looks like the enemy kill zone I was anticipating. And I still think that a key component of that kill zone will be coming over the crest running along the right map edge. So while I can smash some BMP-2s and the second Kiowa can dump its rockets onto point 1140 and the AT-14 team before I give it a good mortaring, I can't be confident leaving the crest outside my deployment zone. The last thing I want is to be caught out in the open, crossing all that open ground. Pushing out right to tackle the Malula keyhole suffers from the same problem, and I'm heavily restricted in going left until my engineers arrive and I can think about plotting a path through the mines. All this means that I don't feel like I have any other option than to engage in some tactical patience for now. 7 minutes in, the anticipated recon team arrives on the shoulder of the mountain. Their job is to get up and secure the summit, but it quickly turns out that there are a couple of stumbling blocks. The first is the sheer reality of the terrain. It's steep, it's 33 degrees C, and jogging up the side of the Jabal Sukfir rapidly exhausts even the recon marines. Getting up the mountain is going to take some time. Second, there are Syrians waiting for them at the top, so I'm going to have to fight for the summit. And I really feel like I need to get up there and exert control. From that dominant position I can get eyes over the right and over the Syrians defending the gorge, and if I can get eyes on something, I can bring my off-map assets to bear and smash the enemy without having to close the distance and fight them up close. Whether I'm going to be able to do that is a different question, and almost as soon as the recon marines get stuck into their task, things get interesting down below. As predicted, Syrian tanks appear over the map edge ridge on the right. The first of these crests the slope and finds itself staring down the barrels of all 4 Abrams. One nails it on the first shot and knocks it out. A second appears 30 seconds later, realises the threat and starts to reverse, only to be hit on the front slope. But it survives, absorbing the sabot round with its explosive reactive armour. That's new. I had given the first tank a quick eyeball and identified it as a T-72 Terms T. There's a chunky thermal imager doghouse on top of the gunner's position, which is a key component of the Terms T fire control upgrade, and that's a variant used exclusively by the Syrian Republican Guard, who I'm expecting here. But I was wrong. T-72 Terms Ts had the older brick block Contact 1 type ERA. These tanks have been kitted out with Contact 5, which is an updated version identifiable here by the angular plates protecting the turret cheeks. Contact 5 is more up to date and is capable of defeating some NATO sabot ammunition, especially older types as used by the Marines. There's only one Syrian tank that mounts Contact 5, that's the T-90, specifically T-90SA. The Syrians really are bringing their A-game. And if I'd ploughed straight down the highway in a rush to save the Cav Scouts, I'd be out in the open with the best tanks of the Republican Guard on my flank. But I'm not. I'm pulled down behind a crest with a platoon of M1A1s, the 2 tow Humvees of the recently arrived CAT, and both of Golf Company's Javelin teams, feeling as confident as I can be going into the next turn. The next T-90 to crest does so on a steeper section of slope, and although it gets a laser warning and starts to back up, it's caught on an angle with its top armour catastrophically exposed. One of the tow Humvees gets into position, only to be annihilated by another T-90, which goes on to take a partial penetration to the front in return and back off. The T-90 that survived getting hit last turn shrugs off a tow from the other Humvee, which strikes it in the flank, but then gets nailed through the gun mount by one of the Abrams. Not exactly the clean sweep I've had taking on Syrian armour up to this point, and the T-90s deserve respect, as evidenced by one reappearing and tanking two simultaneous 120mm sabos, but even so, I'm not the one getting mashed here. When they can't rely on that contact 5, they're vulnerable, as evidenced by the survivor of the double whammy getting knocked out when it has to manoeuvre around the wreck of one of its buddies and exposes its side armour. With 4 knocked out T-90s on the field, this little slice of the battle clearly belongs to the Marines, but it hasn't solved my tactical problem. 4 is a funny number for Syrian tanks, more than a platoon, less than a company, and given the scale of this engagement, I feel like it's reasonable to expect more. We're only about 10 minutes in at this stage with 70 minutes to go. I can afford to indulge in a bit more of that tactical patience and see if any more Republican Guard tankers fancy waltzing onto the stage I've set to fight on my terms. In the meantime, I've got a mountain to climb. The Recon Marines have managed to get into an indecisive, low-intensity firefight with a Syrian team near the summit, and after a quick dose of air-bursting 81s on the enemy to get the message across, are finally closing in on their foxholes. The enemy isn't quiescent about this. The mountainside is devoid of cover and exhausting to negotiate, slowing everything down and leaving the Marines exposed to mortar fire that must have been directed from down below. Luckily, the Marines avoid indirect fire casualties, but up at the crest things are about to go sideways. After mopping up the first set of foxholes, the Marines move in and find another set waiting for them on the reverse slope. One Marine gets shot, and as his buddies go to ground, the Syrians start chucking hand grenades at them. The enemy position here is actually really good. These guys are in foxholes, on a reverse slope, in close range of the crest, and right in front of them, the track leading up to the summit sits on a shelf, giving them an extra metre or so of solid cover that they can drop down behind. In terms of combat mission mechanics, this makes it really difficult to draw a line of sight, and thus really difficult to suppress effectively, not to mention impossible to direct fires onto. So we have a problem. The solution I have lined up is to bring more men to the fight. By now, the engineers have finally arrived, and I immediately sent a squad off to check the minefield blocking the way up the mountain. Probing the edge of the gap in the cliffs, they start finding mines and marking them. Soon, it looks like there's a safe path for infantry up the edge of the gap, and 2 teams of Marine snipers are able to carefully get through. We're in business. Or at least the infantry is. But the minefield is at the bottom of the mountain, and slogging up it on foot is distressingly time-consuming. I really want to get at least one vehicle through to relay infantry to the top. Unwilling to risk one of the AAVs or the recently appeared strikers testing out those marked paths, I bring up one of the Cat Humvees. Annoyingly, these have an unsplittable crew of 4, so I can't just risk the driver, and have to watch as the Humvee slowly turns off the infantry-proven path on the edge into the marked field, a total loss. That's confirmed that as an infantry-only route then, and while I can now start the process of squeezing a Marine infantry platoon through the gap to make the ascent, it's going to be an agonisingly slow process. Meanwhile, although I'm stalled underneath the summit, I do effectively control one side of the mountain, and I'm able to spread the Recon Marine Platoon HQ and FO team around to positions where they can see out over most of the right flank. And they confirm my suspicions, spotting a T-90 and a BMP-2 waiting on the other side of that map edge ridge. I'm not sure what they're waiting for, whether they're standing by to be triggered by a timer or by blue forces advancing down the highway, but I am sure that they're about to have a very bad day. We're half an hour in, and all of my close air support is now on call. The A-10s get to work on the right, first with Mavericks, then 500-pound bombs, then with 30mm cannon, tearing up the Syrians waiting behind the crest. It's open season. The Syrians don't appear to have any air defence, and soon the western horizon is marred by smoke columns. On the other side of the mountain though, things are a little more concerning. Here the Cav scouts have settled into the relative safety of the gorge bottom. I've thrown out a couple of probes, but stopped after one scout team was wiped out by an SPG-9 firing down from the south ridge. Overall, things are pretty stable until some T-62 MVs appear down the valley. There's obviously only one place these tanks can go, and that's right at the Cav scouts. A serious threat, but one which is crossing a keyhole covered by 2 Bradleys. TOWs fly out and destroy 4 T-62s in the first 2 minutes after they're spotted, then the Apaches arrive. One was already on its way to help deal with the bunkers, and I quickly called in the second when the T-62s appeared. While the Bradleys seem to have taken the wind out of the Syrian sails with their tow salvos, the attack helicopters conclusively end the party with their hellfires. One of them also dumps a salvo of 70mm rockets into the road entering the village. It wasn't clear what this was aimed at the time, but later on it turns out to have been a column of BTRs, which is completely devastated. So, thanks to the arrival of US air power as a hard counter to Syrian reinforcements, we're back to some kind of stability. I need to make some forward progress though. The slog up the Jabal Sukfir is burning time in a very uncomfortable way, and with no vehicle rides up the slope, will continue to do so. So I need to unlock the highway and start moving up. The first stage of this was neutralising the Syrian armoured threat on the right map edge. The second stage is to neutralise the Malula keyhole. I know there are enemy forces there. Following up the Kiowas, one of the A-10s dropped a 500-pound bomb on something, and I need to make sure that whatever's there doesn't pose a threat. So off go a couple of Humvees from the Cat. It really sucks to be these guys, I'd just use them for all the suicide missions, but they make it across the wide, open and totally exposed gap between my deployment zone and the relative safety offered by an orchard on the edge of Malula's green zone. They are spotted and engaged. One of the orchard trees intercepts what I assume is an ATGM fired from the centre, but they get away with it. Soon, as the air continues to work, I bring one of the army striker platoons and an MGS up to join them. They start engaging Syrian infantry stragglers in the open, and a few teams still working on point 1140, but they don't take any significant fire in return. Peeking over the edge of the cliffs into Malula itself likewise brings no major Syrian reaction. So the keyhole is, if not necessarily clear, probably a low threat, and with a platoon standing by right next to it to problem solve if a threat does resolve there, I'm about as confident as I can be without taking the risk of going house to house. It looks like the way down the highway is open. And that's good news, because things have not been going well up on the mountain. Spreading round to the right from the problem position on the reverse slope has revealed more dug-in Syrians. With supporting fire from one of the teams further down the shoulder, the Recon Marine Platoon HQ storms one set of foxholes, neutralising another in depth in the process, only to run into a third on the reverse slope that wipes them out. This is on top of more casualties sustained when the enemy managed to bring another fire mission in, leaving me even more dependent on the rifle squads trailing up the mountain to reinforce the Recon Marines. The snipers are already up, but I've sent them off onto the far left where they can get eyes on the village and start spotting targets for the artillery. Instead, they mostly get carried away trying to engage some BTRs with their Barretts and get themselves first machine gunned and then mortared. When the infantry finally does make it up to the summit, they have just as much trouble trying to deal with that Syrian problem position as the Recon Marines. By now we're 50 minutes in, and my frustration with this single team of Syrians is starting to get the better of me. Eventually I manage to disengage my tunnel vision and send a small team around to the left where they can enfilade the track and get a good line onto the offending enemy. With some suppressive fire from that direction finally convincing the Syrians to stay down, the lone survivor of one of the rifle teams storms forward, puts a burst into a PKM gunner, and then lobs a grenade into the final occupied foxhole. Problem solved. There is one final Syrian team up here, but now that I can muscle in with more bodies from multiple angles, it doesn't last long, and I can fully occupy the summit of the Jabal Sukfir. To some extent, this problem has been one I've made for myself. The problem position ultimately accounted for 12 Marines because I fed them to it, and it took me far too long to zoom out a little bit and exploit the flanking position that ultimately did them in. And that's without factoring in the way I managed to stage an infantry-only engagement with no supporting weapons and no combined arms against a dug-in, well-positioned opponent, despite having a mechanised force with copious amounts of off-map assets to call on. But it's done now, and I finally get round to spotting targets on the far side of the map to support the Cav Scouts and identify any enemy positions that might contest the advance of my main force down the highway. And it doesn't look like there are any. I now have another 5 Abrams online, all from the army, and have been extending them left to try and provoke any lingering Syrian ATGMs over on the right. One of the tanks catches an AT7, but it doesn't do very much. The culprit is again enemy infantry around point 1140, so that gets another good dose of firepower. One of the striker NGSs survives being sent out into the open, so it looks like that first stretch of highway up to the intersection is clear. From here, I don't want to follow the highway. I want to pass through the choke point between the cliffs and the caravanserai to get onto the lower shoulder of the Jabal al-Saqfiyah, where I can cover the far side of the gorge and cut out the totally not an ambush trust me bro route the highway takes through the western orchards. That takes me past the caravanserai though, which seems like a likely enemy strongpoint. By means of confirmation, the MGS is narrowly missed by an RPG when I send it forward. There are uncons on the roof, who first get a dose of fire from the overwatching Abrams before I smother the whole site with air-bursting mortars. That gives me enough cover to make a run with one of the Abrams, which manages to bog under the cliffs. It's only at that point that I spot some foxholes on the cliff top. Perfect positions for sneaky little RPG teams. Thankfully, these prove to be unoccupied. The uncons have all evidently retreated off the rooftops though, and with a lack of windows, seem unlikely to pose a threat unless they stick their heads up again. I am able to push an Abrams pair, an MGS, and a couple of striker infantry carriers through, leaving one squad to occupy the foxholes and provide some extra security. Everything else pushes on over the shoulder of the mountain to help out the scouts. By now, things have gotten lively in the gorge again. With spotters up on the mountaintop and plenty of assets to go around, I've been dumping mortars and artillery onto enemy positions up on the south ridge. The aim here is to unlock the route into the farm objective, which itself is pretty quiet, at least at the close end. There are still a few enemy AT assets surviving down the valley though, an SPG-9 and an AT-4 in foxholes that the Apaches missed. The AT-4 manages to get a missile into one scout team I try to send up the hill on the right, so I edge one of the recently arrived Abrams and the MGS up to the crest of the gorge to sort them out. It takes them a while to actually finish them off, but sustained MG fire from both vehicles is itself decisive in keeping the Syrians' heads down, and the door is open to storm both the south ridge and the farm. Sending a striker squad down into the gorge, through the Cav Scouts and up the far side demonstrates a lack of resistance, and, joined by one of the Bradleys, the infantry jump out and take the objective building up there. The farm offers slightly more of a threat. A whole squad of Syrian infantry lurking in one of the buildings opens up as I probe forward, but with time running out about as fast as my patience is, I have one of the supporting Bradleys just bring the building down on top of them. With that done and the far end of the objective smacked about by some 120mm mortars, the Cav Scouts move up and secure the objective. I don't have time to move on the village and the mansion objectives further down the valley, but I can afford to divert the security elements I left to cover the caravanserai towards the western orchards. This little detachment uncovers a series of trenches dug around the crossroads and a collection of Syrian infantry who make the smart decision to bail when the tanks open up on them. There's no way I'm going to clear the whole objective in the time remaining, but by inserting the striker squad I can at least deny it to the enemy if it's a shared objective. And with that done, the timer runs out. The result is a major victory for the US. The Syrians haven't surrendered, and there are still plenty of them hanging around, but the back of the defence has been broken, and by securing the Jabal Saqfiyah and the objectives adjacent to the gorge, in addition to inflicting heavy losses, I've scored the victory points I need to prevail. This has come at the cost of 59 casualties. The Bradley that ate an ATGM on turn 1, the tow Humvee schwacked by a T-90, and the Humvee that I drove into a minefield. The Syrians have, to what should be no one's surprise, suffered wildly disproportionately. They sustained 331 casualties in total, including 6 men taken prisoner, to go along with the loss of 7 T-90 SAs, 5 T-62 MVs, 9 BMP-2s, 8 BTRs, and a handful of light vehicles. This was mostly the work of the A-10s and the Apaches, but the Cav Scout Bradleys also accounted for a significant portion, which kind of begs the question of exactly how much help they really needed. If anything, my biggest problem wasn't the ambushed army element, but the fight over the summit of Jabal Suqfiyah being throttled by a small minefield. I can't help but wonder how much easier that would have been if I had had the ability to reliably clear the mines, or escaped my tunnel vision earlier to storm past the caravanserai and bring support up the mountain the long way round. Regardless, we've successfully allowed the Syrians to try and ambush us and dealt them a decisive blow before they had the good sense to flee into Lebanon or disperse into the civilian population. Now it's on to Damascus. Hope you all enjoyed this one and found it interesting. If you'd like to watch these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.